everyone. It's my privilege to welcome Pastor Lyndelle. She's come all the way from Melbourne.
Yes, all the way.
Yes, and so we're delighted to have you here at Rosny. Lyndelle's role is that she is the AUC Ministerial Director, and which means that she's in charge of the ministerial secretaries for the conference. But just tell us, our church folk, what your role entails.
Yeah, so it's actually a really good job, as you know, Mark, because you're a ministerial secretary yourself. And I get to, the easiest way to explain it is the pastor to the pastors. At the union level, that looks like coordinating the team of ministerial secretaries all over Australia. So I think there's about 14 of us. So that's facilitating advisories, and at the AUC we work through all the internship and progressions and ordinations commissioning process. And also just, sorting out pastors and supporting pastors and helping them have all the tools that they need to do their job to the best of their God-given ability. So it's a lot of fun.
And Lyndelle does a terrific job. You work very hard at it, and we're grateful to have you in that role. And sometimes I think it's like herding cats, isn't it? Trying to get all them insects together.
It is a little bit like that. It's a lot of fun. Yeah. Especially that Tasmanian ministerial secretary. He's particular challenge. Whoops, sorry, I didn't realise. No.
Yeah. That's when you turn the mic off.
No, we have a lot of fun.
Yeah. So in your role, you travel around Australia a fair bit, and you also would visit some of the churches around the district. So in the times that you've been visiting the churches and that, what would you see as some of the challenges and the great things that are happening, and some of the challenges?
Look, there's a lot of great things happening across Australia. And I guess I'm biased, but we have an incredible pastoral team. Like I've got a colleague who works, at a GC in a GC space, so he gets to chat to churches and pastors and administrators all over the world. And when you look at the way that we're organised in Australia and just the calibre of our pastoral team, we're incredibly blessed in this country. When I look at churches, we're all facing the same challenges, and that is, and I was talking a little bit about this last night. How do you reach a world that no longer seems to have any sort of interest in Christianity? There's no real sense of biblical literacy. They don't have concepts of God or the Bible taught, even as children. This move towards a secular nation is an increasing challenge. But what I do see as I travel around Australia is churches that are really committed to going out and being the hands and feet of Jesus. So incredible community service projects, creative evangelism methods, really just pushing the boundaries in terms of trying to reach our nation. So, it's a really inspiring to see various different churches, and I'm sure Rosny has got their own things that they're doing that is inspiring as well. So,
great, thanks for that. Now, you were saying just a wee bit before 11 o'clock that you were raised as an Adventist.
I was, yes.
Yes. So, third or fourth generation Adventist and that. But as you were growing, and then you came had this idea of becoming a minister and ordained, and I'm just sort of wondering, in your journey in becoming an Adventist, was there a time when it sort of just went click? And you've heard a bit of my story. For me, it was my last year of high school, which feels like an eternity ago. I'd grown up in the Adventist church. My grandparents converted, and also both my parents on both sides. We grew up in Warburton. We lived there all my life, so I was very... I'd only ever seen the four walls of the Yarra Valley and Warburton Church. And I think when I got to the end of year 12 and was looking at what do I do with my life, it was a religion studies teacher that really challenged me and said, so, you say one thing and do another, what are you going to do? You're going to make Christianity a real thing for you, and you're going to truly accept Jesus.
And at that point, I was doing Bible studies with my religion teacher, and he was showing me a side of the Bible that wasn't your typical Sabbath school kind of stuff, and introduced me to a picture of Jesus. He wasn't afraid to answer any of the tricky questions that I had, and so I had a lot of respect for him for that. And I was learning so much great stuff in my Bible studies that I would force all my friends into their own Bible studies that I would then give to them on the bus and at school and at lunchtime and after school and before school, to the point where my religion studies teacher said, you know, you can do this as a job. So after some thought and prayer, I decided to go to Avondale and study and train to become a pastor, because that's where I felt like God was leading. But that is a whole other story. There's a lot of different things that fell into place that made it clear to me that that's where God wanted me to be.
Yeah, no, that's terrific. Lyndelle, we're delighted to have you here at Rosny, and Lyndelle will be sharing with the pastors on Monday. We've got a meeting with the pastors, and so we're grateful to come for that.
Yeah.
But thank you for today.
No worries. It's my pleasure. It's a real privilege to be here at Rosny, so thank you for having me, and it's always nice to be able to share and spend some time in Tasmania, because I love Tasmania. I've got Georgie, one of my daughters, with me. My husband's got the other daughter. He's a pastor in Victoria, and so we jumped at the opportunity to come down to Tassie and be with the ministers, but also to spend some time in your beautiful state, which is we absolutely love it down here. So it's really nice to be here. So, have I got my clicker working? I'll try to stay up with my clicker, because sometimes I can be a terrible clicker. I just make sure I've got you the right sides. Yeah, when God says go, but particularly when God says go to the nation that we're now looking at, to the context that we're now looking at. But I want to take you back to when God said go, not the first time, but maybe the first time for our context. I'm a huge fan of Adventist history. I love, in my spare time, you're going to think I'm a big nerd now, but in my spare time I love to go online and look into the Adventist history archives and read old records and old documents and old committee minutes from all different various things that happened all over the world for Adventism not only in our country but all over the world. So I want to take you back to when God said go to a man called Stephen Haskell. Stephen Haskell at the time was the conference president for a conference in the US called the Californian Conference. And he'd heard that Ellen White had a vision for a particular time and a particular place and a particular mission area. She had told him that God had given her a vision that the gospel was to go to a new frontier. And so Stephen Haskell turned around and he said to her, did God say specifically where this new frontier is to be? And she had to think about it and then she goes, I don't think so. And then she came back and she said, yes, he did. In my vision, the angel said to go to Australia. And from that point, Stephen Haskell became quite obsessed with the idea of spreading the mission to Australia. But the pathway to Adventist mission would actually start at a funeral. It was the funeral of a man by the name of Brigadier General Lyons. Now, that may name mean nothing to you and it means nothing to me, and honestly, it isn't a key part of this story, but there is a particular part of this story that is key. There was a missionary by the name of Hannah More who was attending this funeral, and it just so happened that after the funeral, she saw that there was an evangelistic meeting conducted by Stephen Haskell just across the road. So she wanders into the evangelistic meeting after the funeral, and she ends up standing at the back and listening to what he had to say about the seventh-day Sabbath, and she picks up a handful of literature and she takes it back to Africa with her. You're going, why Africa? I thought you were saying we were talking about Australia. Well, just hold on a second. In Africa, she was a missionary for another Christian denomination, and she was a missionary with an Australian by the name of Alexander Dixon. Now, she started telling him about what Stephen Haskell had told her, and he ended up becoming a seventh-day Sabbath keeper at the time. She became a seventh-day Sabbath keeper, and their missionary organisation found out and kicked them out of the missionary program because they're like, well, hang on, you don't align with us anymore. So she went back to the US, Alexander Dixon went to Australia, and Stephen Haskell got really excited because ever since he'd heard it from Ellen White about this dream, the angel said, to go to Australia. He was obsessed with getting a team to Australia. So what he would do is they would print literature and he would post it to Australia. He was trying to get in contact with Alexander Dixon, and what he would do is he would write on the just random addresses in Australia that he could think of, and they'd send thousands and thousands of pamphlets over to Australia, some to the public libraries, some to the town halls, anything to get the work over there. He eventually got in contact with Andrew Dixon about 20 years later, and it turns out that he really wanted his job, so he'd given up the Seventh-day Sabbath and gone back, and so he felt really discouraged that there was no way that they're going to enter into Australia. But he did not give up because God had said go, and he was willing to go. So, as the president of California Conference, he stood up at the 1884 session and he said, we need to take a group of missionaries to Australia, but we need money to do it. And this is what he said to encourage them to give. So Mark, you might want to use something like this if you're doing a stewardship series or, for the building fund, we'll see. This is what he said. He said, there are many persons among us worth from $10,000 to $150,000, so very specific. And he said, I wonder if these persons really desire to lay up treasure in heaven, or do they desire to wait and see it burned in the flames of the last days and very likely themselves with it? You can use that, you're welcome. You kind of feel pretty compelled to give after that. So some good pastoring tactics. We don't recommend that kind of language now. But anyway, so obviously people gave, and they had enough money to put 11 colporteurs and 11 missionaries on a boat in May 10, 1885, on a boat called the Australia, I should say, and they left San Francisco and they headed to Sydney. Now, I did ministry in Sydney for 10 years, but I still agree with them when they found that Sydney wasn't that exciting and Melbourne was the place to be, because they promptly left Sydney and they headed down to Melbourne. It was the most populous city at the time. The problem was God had said go, but the context was awful. They struggled with this new breed of person, this Australian. They just could not understand who these Australians were. They were kind of ochre, and they were didn't have the graces of the Americans or the British. They couldn't quite figure it out. And the weather was awful. It would rain all the time, and it was cold, and they arrived in August, and you know what August is like. And in his letters, there was a man on the boat with Haskell called John Corliss, I should say. And John Corliss wrote in his personal letters, it was hard work. The weather is bleak, the people are bleak, the city is bleak. They were met with so much opposition from the pulpit and the press, they just struggled. People didn't particularly understand their accents. They found themselves being referred to as those odd Yankees, and it was not a favourable label to wear. They were also preaching a really bizarre message that no one had heard before, and the Melburnians are going, what are you talking about? Sabbath or Sunday? Just one of the strange new doctrines that these well-to-do Melburnians had a bit of suspicion around. Who were these people? They're setting up tents, they're printing literature. John was really frustrated, and the story goes, and you might have read this, there's a kids' book that's come out from the AUC Resource Centre called The Leaves of Hope about this particular story, and it goes that John Corliss stood in various places around the city handing out pamphlets, but encountered little success. He'd watch people take the pamphlet and then throw it on the ground 6 metres ahead. And so it was in the freezing August rain, with the last track that in his hand, it says that he wandered up to the Richmond Oval and he stabbed that track in frustration onto the picket fence and goes home for dinner. A little while later, he didn't realise this until a little while later, walking down the road that evening, splashing in the puddles, was a man by the name of, aptly, William Miller, which is ironic really, because William Miller was the 1844 guy. And he was a printer. William Miller notices that there's this pamphlet on the picket fence and there's a heap of them all over the floor. He's going, what's going on here? Picks it up, starts reading about the seventh-day Sabbath, and realises that this is written by a guy called John Corliss, promptly tracks him down and interrupts his dinner and says, come to my debating society and come and debate what you're talking about in this track. And sure enough, as a result of that first debate, we love a good debate, 11 people became Sabbath-keeping Adventists. And by 1901, Australia was becoming a federation of states. The Adventist Church had already formed 7 conferences and had already doubled the membership of the Californian Conference, much to Stephen Haskell's happiness. But this is all because God had said go and people had said yes. And all throughout Scripture we see examples of where God says go and people say yes. The example of Abraham way back in Genesis. God says go and he says, this is what I'm going to do for you, Abraham. Go from your country, your people and your father's household to the land I will show you. I'll make you into a great nation and I will bless you. I'll make your name great and you will be a blessing. God called him to go, to step out of the familiar, the comfortable, the known environment and go to the land that God would tell him. God would show him. And beyond this call, it was a conversion point for Abram because we know he becomes Abraham. Then God says go again. Hang on, I've put my wrong verse in. Abraham takes off and within 100 years we see the birth of the nation because God said go, Abraham said yes. Throughout the rest of Genesis, we read Joseph goes. Mind you, not willingly, he was kind of taken away, but Joseph goes under difficult circumstances, brings salvation, though, to his family, relief during the time of a famine, and reveals an incredible power of God to the pagan Egyptian people. Then after the death of then after hundreds of years of oppression in Egypt, God says to Moses, okay, it's time for you to go. Go out and leave Egypt, go into the wilderness, go to the land that I will show you. He reveals the power of God to the pagan Egyptian nation because he delivers them through the Red Sea and takes them out, albeit into the wilderness, but then eventually to the land of Canaan. Then after the death of Moses, God calls Joshua to go. And it goes on and on and on. The story continues. Joshua leads the people of Israel to the land he promised. Joshua takes Israel and they go across the country. And God is revealed as they encounter pagan nations and defeat those pagan nations, sometimes with just the blow of a trumpet or the smash of a crash of a clay pot. The story goes on and on. God says to go and God's people go. There is much to learn from these leaders about how they go. So evangelism, or going, declaring the glory of God to other nations, was God's intention for Israel. We often think, oh no, God had his holy people and he was growing a nation, this nation that he told Abraham would come as a part. But if you look at the story, the overarching story, everywhere that Israel went, they were revealing the power of their God over foreign gods. The God of Israel became renowned as the God that delivered his people. So evangelism was God's intention for Israel. In Solomon's prayer over the temple, he says this: "In the future, foreigners who do not belong to your people Israel will hear of you. They will come from distant lands because of your great name and your strong hand and your powerful arm," talking about the God of Israel. "And when they pray toward this temple, then hear from heaven where you lived and grant what they ask of you. In this way, all the people of earth will come to know and fear you, just as your own people Israel do. They too will know that this temple I've built honours your name." Even early on in the piece, Solomon is recognising that God is drawing other nations to himself through the people of Israel going. And so the evangelistic intention that God has of drawing pagan nations, of drawing others to himself, continues into the New Testament. In the New Testament, God has this enlarged reputation through the Jewish nation, but religion no longer is a fundamental feature of society like in the New Testament. In the New Testament, you're looking at pagan Rome, you're looking at the oppression of the Jews. And even into the New Testament, though, we see God come into the form of a man and die on the cross and call us to go. So what does this mean for us, though? What does it mean for us when we're called to go? It's not the same as in the Old Testament. It's not the same as in the New Testament. It's not even the same as 120 years ago when Adventism first came into Australia. In 2024, we no longer live in a society that has a theocratic emphasis. We live in what's called a post-God, post-Christian society. In fact, as I was talking to the group here last night, we're living in a society that is increasingly hostile toward even the belief in God. So how do we go, just like God has been calling us from the beginning of time, how do we go in an openly challenging and hostile and anti-God environment? Well, I think we've got a lot to learn from the children of Israel, from the people of Israel in the Old Testament. And there's a couple of different options that we can do when it comes to going in a challenging secular world, or in a world that seems to be hostile to faith. So here's one option. This is what we could do if we wanted to go in a secular age. We could have the go along to get along response. So what do I mean by that? We just accept that, okay, we now live in a secular society and we compartmentalise our life. At home, I'm at home. On Sabbath, I'll do my Christian thing. Monday to Friday, I'll just do my regular work thing. My faith doesn't necessarily need to interact with the rest of my life. I'll keep church here, church friends, church stuff here, and I'll keep me and myself and my own things here. This is a good, easy option because it means as a Christian, I get to lie low and just blend in. My approach to work or business, I'll act with integrity and that sort of stuff, but my faith doesn't need to interact with any other part of my life. I'll save my faith for Sabbath and church and my Christian friends, and then with my secular world and secular response friends, I can keep that separate. We accept, there's nothing or little to be gained in fighting the increasing secular culture. And, if I keep things separate, then things remain civil and I can be on good terms with everyone. The problem is this really consistent with Jesus' call to go into the world and be the salt and light of the earth? Is this consistent with this idea of going? It's a type of going, but it puts faith in one area and the rest of my life in the other. So that's one response we could do. Another option is we could do the monastic response. This isn't a new response. The monastic response has been happening in every generation when Christianity sort of becomes, not the big thing, or when it becomes, I don't want to use the word persecuted, but when it becomes hostile. So the idea with the monastic response is, let's just retreat from society. It's too hard. Let's build a protective wall around ourselves between the world and the Christian community. Let's maintain and conserve and preserve what we've got here, but let's keep separate because we don't want to be influenced by that world either. We've got to be careful, the increasing secularism, the increasing anti-God narrative, let's keep that separate. And for some, that could be let's retreat up into the country, let's move out of the cities where we know it can be increasingly dangerous if we understand the way that the world's going to change. And some suggest as Christians we need to usher in this new era of monasticism. Let's have our own thing, keep ourselves together, let's not fight the changing culture, but let's keep ourselves removed from it. I won't engage with it, I won't interact with secular people, I'll just keep away and preserve what I've got. World and culture have gone from bad to worse, I'm just not going to engage with it. I'm going to stick with my faith and my church community and not even go out there, away from the public eye, off the grid, away from social media, completely disengaged. So that's one option as well. We could do that. Or we could be a little bit more aggressive. Society was once Christian. Australia was built on Christian values. Our laws are based on the Ten Commandments. There was, Christianity had a huge part to play in the development of the nation as we know it now as Australia. And this needs to be restored. So let's fight it. We see this playing out a little bit in American politics at the moment, if you follow any of that stuff. But it's this attitude of we need to recover
the Christian voice and Christian presence. We must keep fighting to restore some of those values within our nation. This war, this culture war that we can fight is quite politicised, and it can play out in a variety of different ways. Some of it in the courts. You think of some of the conversations in the US about religious freedom, and in our own backyard about religious freedom, about saying prayer at educational institutions or all sorts of things. We might fight it within those educational institutions, saying we've got to teach certain things and certain things must be on the curriculum, or in the law courts. We think about some of the legislation that's been passed recently about what you can and cannot say, and about kids and gender and all that sort of stuff, and we should be fighting this. We should fight against it. Culture war response says that we are in a battle and we need to preserve and sustain Christian values at any cost and fight against this increasing secularization. There are also two enemies in this war. One is secularization itself, and other is this sort of perceived threat. So it could be other religions or multiculturalism or anti-government, that sort of stuff. This is a fight response, saying we need to retain and get back where we were. So what do you think? Is there a better way? Excuse me. Is there a better way to exist in an increasing secular world? Do we just go along and get along, keep faith separate? Do we just retreat, or do we fight against it, or is there another response? Well, I hope you're all waiting for another response. I hope you think that the other responses are not going to work, because I would argue that there is another response. And this is the one that we see in Scripture. It's called the response of faithful presence. Or the response of a cough in my throat. Can you pass me my water bottle, Georgie? Thank you, darling. So what is the faithful presence response? Well, this response says, rather than seeking to leverage power within political systems and preserve certain values, rather than running away and the church can and must not only accept but embrace the current climate and the current situation. So what does that mean? That doesn't mean that we have to accept the beliefs and the culture around us, but it recognises that it's going to be a real challenge to try and fight it, but it's naive to just move away and be resigned from it. And we get this idea of faithful presence from a passage in the Old Testament. So if we jump back into the Old Testament in Jeremiah, this is, excuse me, in Jeremiah, this is what happens to the people of Israel. So the Israel nation are finding themselves in a similar situation. They've been enjoying peace and prosperity in their promised land. They exist in a theocracy. Gods are recognised, whether it's pagan God or the God of Israel. It is recognised that religion and spirituality is a part of life. Israel has a king to excuse me. Israel has a king to rule them and a God to govern them, but they have in the past struggled under lawless and unethical kings. Anyway, Josiah comes along. King Josiah comes along, and he is different. Remember, Josiah discovers the scrolls. He brings reform and repentance and revival to the nation of Israel. But then Babylon defeats the Egyptians. Josiah is killed at the Battle of Megiddo, and the Babylonians overpower Jerusalem and put a guy called Zedekiah on the throne. During this time, God raises up a young prophet by the name of Jeremiah, and Jeremiah starts preaching a very unpopular message about the coming exile into Babylon. And though Zedekiah resists, the nation of Israel is taken over by Babylon, and it's basically split up and spread around. And what happens is, and we read about this in the story of Daniel, the brightest kids from the city of from Jerusalem are taken to Babylon, and they become exiles. So these young guys, these Israelites, are now finding themselves trying to navigate life in a pagan nation, the nation of Babylon, with a government that is not only openly hostile to their Judaism, to their worship and their practices in following God, but also has control over a lot of their lives, where they work, where they live, where they could travel, what language they would speak.
And I'm not suggesting that the parallels between their situation and ours are identical, but for the Jews this was an incredibly difficult time. But what we can learn from them is how these Israelites who were in exile in Babylon, in an openly hostile, non-religious nation, what did they do and how did they react, and how did they have a positive influence on those around them? So how does God counsel the Israelites through the prophet Jeremiah as they enter into exile? And this is what it says. This is what the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of Israel, says to all the captives he has exiled to Babylon from Jerusalem. Build homes and plan to stay. Plant gardens and eat the food they produce. Marry and have children. Then find spouses for them so that you may have many grandchildren. Multiply, do not dwindle away, and work for the peace and prosperity of the city where I sent you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, and its welfare will determine your welfare. So God is telling the God of Israel is telling the captives here, don't retreat and go off and keep yourselves away in a monastic response. Don't fight against Babylon, because the reality is they won't win that fight. Don't compartmentalize and just keep this separate and that separate and just, acquiesce into what Babylon is. But instead, he says, build homes, plan to stay, plan to be there for a long time, don't dwindle away, multiply, have an impact, but work for the peace and the prosperity of your captors, of the Babylonian people where you were sent into exile. He says, pray to God for it, for its welfare will determine your welfare. And so I look at this passage and I go, how do we interact? I mean, we're not living in Babylon, admittedly, but we're living in a nation that is moving towards secularization, where God is no longer relevant, where religion is no longer relevant and increasingly shrinking in significance. And what he says to the Israels in Babylon is work for the good, work for peace and prosperity. Don't just retreat, don't just avoid it, don't just ignore it, but pray for them and work with them. And so how do we be a faithful presence? And I want to finish with a couple of things here. Number one is to remember the glory of God. Now, God was the one who exiled them to Babylon, admittedly, not Nebuchadnezzar. God is the author of this exile. Jeremiah says it was because of the way that they acted that they ended up in Babylon. And as the prophets tried to establish, this is God's will. Now, I'm not suggesting that our current climate is God's will, but the Bible does warn us that as we get towards the end of time, things will become increasingly challenging for us as followers of Jesus. So we need to remember that God is still in control. God is above and beyond and all over this, even when it doesn't feel like it. Secondly, we can maintain a distinct identity even as the people of God. We can maintain our distinct identity even as we begin to look vastly different from those around us. Jeremiah says, work for the peace and prosperity of the city. Pray to the Lord for it. He advised the king and the people of Judah to cooperate, accept the reality, don't shy and shut yourselves away, but engage. Don't be monastic, but engage. And he goes on to say, this is what the Lord says, do not act like the other nations who try to read their future in the stars. Do not be afraid of their predictions, even though other nations are terrified. Their ways are futile and foolish. They cut down a tree and a craftsman carves an idol. They decorate it with gold and silver and then fasten it. So he's talking about the idols that they built. He says, don't be afraid of such gods, for they can neither harm you nor do you any good. And I think sometimes our tendency is to look at our changing culture and look at the changing values of culture and feel fearful. But God says, no, I'm bigger than that. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid because I am bigger than that. And so we can maintain our distinctive identity as people of God without having to fear what the future holds. And finally, seek their good and speak hope. Speak hope into their lives. Jeremiah said, build homes, plant gardens, plan to stay. False prophets had been telling the exiles that they would be there for 2 years max. But Jeremiah knows better. And so for those in the cultural warfare camp, their desire is to try and return things by fighting against the changing culture. If we can just hold out long enough, we can return things to the way they used to be. But the attitude here is different. Work for their good. Don't fight it. Establish yourself within the new context. Maintain your identity. Build and plant. Have children. Have grandchildren.
and let that be an expression of faith to those around you, that resilience and willingness to stay and be a positive presence of seeking their good and speaking hope in the nation around you. And it challenges us to work for the good of the community that you are called to. And so we look at our increasingly changing society, and there is a temptation to be afraid of all the various different things that are going on. We think of our children and what that means for their future. We think of the good times of maybe when we were growing up, when life looked a little bit different. And we look ahead, and it's tempting to be fearful of what's going to happen and what God is going to do. We hear about wars overseas. We hear about political climates. We hear about economic and financial challenges that may be ahead. But what does it mean to not take a monastic approach and pull away, to not take an aggressive and cultural wars approach and fight it, but rather to be a faithful presence, to continue to maintain our people of God identity, to continue to seek and work for the good of those around us, and to not shrink back in fear, but instead be stable and recognise that God is above all, God is above everything, and that God is going to continue to work for our good as we continue to work for the good of those around us. And so I wanted to challenge you this morning that as we interact, as we think about Rosny Church and what they can do to impact their community, your community, what does it look like to be a faithful presence? What does it look like to not compartmentalise my life? This is my Sabbath and my church person, but it doesn't affect the rest of my week or the rest of my day. What does it look like to have a faith that interacts with every part of my life, that isn't fearful of the future, that isn't retreating from what's going on in the world, that isn't fighting and being aggressive to what's going on in the world, but is being a light that sits within the context that we've got, that speaks their good, that speaks hope, and is a faithful presence. So I want to encourage you that this morning, I think the worship team is going to come up and sing a final song. And as we sing this final song, I want you to think about your own world and which of these approaches resonate to you. Do you feel a tendency to shrink back and want to stay away from it all? Do you feel a tendency to want to be aggressive and fight against the changes that are happening in our culture? And I challenge you to think about, what does it look like for you to be a faithful presence, to recognise that God is still in control and that God is still working, and that through our influence and through our faithful presence we can have an impact on those around us.